asked to speak today. I'm not an ISTC employee, I never have been, but I work very closely with ISTC over the years. Came into this about the middle of their 30 years. They're very good to me in funding a number of projects. And I was asked to talk about some the collaborations among the surveys on some particular projects that you've got some background on from our previous speakers. And, you know, obviously it's critical that we are reducing our waste streams and contamination environment, but there's still a lot of legacy contamination out there. And this is kind of where I came into this. Looking at ISTC-led collaborations examining complex place-based legacy environmental contamination and degradation issues. A number of people that were investigators on these projects provided materials for this presentation. And there were a lot of other people who facilitated these studies and other partners that were involved in these. So I don't want to suggest that we were, the only ones involved here. But also the chemists. So we kind of overwhelmed the lab in those years with samples through these projects. And some of you will, going back a ways, will recognize some of these folks, only one of which is here, a much younger John Scott. And also Loretta Scowen who was with the State Water Survey, who I provided a lot of my samples, at least initially, to. So we don't forget the folks behind the scene that are critical to these efforts. And so we heard a little bit about Depew. This was the site of a zinc smelter beginning in the late 1800s. And there were some other activities that went on there, sulfuric acid production and lithopone production. There was New Jersey Zinc was the initial owner, and they've changed hands several times. A number of companies that are since defunct, but others like Mobile Viacom, who are among the principal parties, responsible parties. And so this contamination, this is obviously downslope here. So for all these years, these materials were being carried towards the lake and accumulating in the lake sediments. This ditch in particular, the concentrations of zinc and copper were into the percent range in some of these sediments. And I remember looking at the water in some areas was this lime green from all the copper and zinc in those materials. And as somebody mentioned, there was an effort to, this was a company town, so when the manufacturing stopped, the economic viability of the town essentially went downhill and ceased. And so there was an effort to increase some injection of money into the community, and the solution was these little boat races. And this is a big deal there in the summertime. And so, these, as Rich Cahill and his colleagues have long determined, this lake and a lot of other backwater lakes were becoming sedimented in. And so they dredged an oval in this area, and the state, the DNR at the time, Department of Conservation, this fell on them to do this dredging. They bought some land here and made, as was necessary, made a retention basin for those sediments dredged out of the lake. And once those sediments became consolidated, it was easy to turn this into a managed wetland, add some water control structures, be able to let water out, let the moist soil plants grow, and then flood it again in the fall. And so, as this was became added to the NPL list, they were trying to decide, what should be done, who were the responsible parties, and DNR was listed because they had moved some of this material out of the lake and placed it on the floodplain. And so at the time, it's really hard to come by these old pictures. I think we've not done didn't do a good job archiving things in those days, as hopefully we are today. But this is we had some on-site kind of orientations, and I can identify most of these people, but some of them I don't remember. everybody's less gray, and it seems probably slimmer than they were at that time. These studies, the agreement was that we could go ahead. There was a fellow by the name of Steve Davis, some of you might remember, who was kind of the remediations program manager, worked for ISTC, but also IEPA and DNR at various times. Said, you know, we have this great, these scientists with this background, this expertise. Why should we pay consultants to do this? We can be doing this ourselves and providing them some work. And of course, we're always glad, you know, for research funds. So we had these orientations. But the agreement was we do this under the oversight of the Illinois IPA, who was heading up this, be handling the Superfund and the remediation and plans and all that. So this is Rich Lang, who's a really interesting character, to say the least. And so I responded to an RFP that ISTC put out, and as did some other scientists at the surveys, and ultimately this led to a variety of projects. Some of them being, sampling was done under some arduous conditions. Here they're actually standing in wastewater to sample the wells that were put in. This water survey and a geologic survey. Rich Cahill and Bill Bodner and some others were sampling sediments within the lake, looking at not only sedimentation but the pattern of the contaminants within the sediments. And then some of the projects I had involved things like small mammals and plants, uptake and exposure, ducks, which was the main focus of the now waterfowl impoundment or managed wetland. Also, DNR actually has management authority over the lake itself also, so we went in and mucked it up and put some sediments out. So a variety of projects were going on at that time. And of course, that all boils down after a lot of hard work and machinations into some information that could be used, not only by in trying to determine whether there were natural resources damages that the DNR was responsible for, but also information that, hopefully we could use to further our knowledge of these processes and contamination and how metals and elements move and the chemistry with flooding, because this was regularly flooded, but also, the floodplain of river floods on a regular basis, how wildlife are exposed to these things. Again, how's the profile of these toxic metals changed within the lake itself. And these resulted in a variety of publications. As you probably know, ISTC is a clearinghouse. They do publish reports from the research that they fund and are involved with, and also resulted in a number of peer-reviewed publications. So not only are we providing information to be used for management purposes, but also for the broader knowledge base and understanding of these things. Someone asked about the current. The result of that was DNR was absolved of. There were some changes. There was some movement of metals and some uptake. The little higher exposure than there was an increased exposure, but it wasn't to levels of concern. So they were kind of absolved of responsibility for this. But as far as the town and the zinc smelter itself, there were some remedial activities. For example, they treat the water coming off the site, and they're removing thousands of pounds of metals every year, and so the responsible parties have to pay for that. They seeded some vegetation on the smelter area. So some of these things remain. The yards still remain some level of contamination in the town. You can see here that there was a documented cluster of MS in the community. And although the Depew Group, as the responsible parties and the consultants are nicknamed, they have done some mandated changes and remediations. They've not done an entire cleanup. They've not removed the god pile, which, the rumor was that there's millions and millions of dollars worth of recoverable metals in that god pile, but that our technology is not such to make it economic feasible to do that. And the Pew Group has drugged their heels, and the villagers have kind of thrown up their hands. Somebody help us. And actually, the Northwestern University School of Law, their advocacy center, environmental advocacy center, has taken this on pro bono relatively recently. And so they're hoping that they even have a website, Clean Up the Pew, and they've unleashed their students on this issue. And so the village is hopeful that this will get them some movement on actually the final cleanup of that site. I'm going to change, that started in about 1997, 98 or so, into the early first year, couple years, maybe 2001, 2002. I don't remember exactly, but about that time frame. And then right on the heels of that came the issue at Lake Calumet, wetlands, which you heard about some good background on that. Good segue into this, my discussion of it. And so I don't really need to go much into the issue of the industry and how this came to be, but it became apparent there was still a lot of biodiversity in this area. You had these wetlands that were protected kind of by default because either they were owned by a variety of owners, and it was hard to decipher who actually owned those parcels, or they were in the back 40 of industry, and they'd never done anything with those areas. And so it was recognized there was a lot of bastions, if you will, of biodiversity in these areas, and also that there was a need for wildlife conservation, natural resources conservation, and also green space in those communities and those areas. And so again, WMRC, or at that time WMRC, ISTC had RFP and also approached some of us about some work in these areas, as did the folks at the Chicago Department of Environment, which I believe is no longer right now. But some of you will know Suzanne Malik McKenna, who's a real go-getter, and her and her protege Nicole Kamens, real go-getters, and recognize this that there could be there's some real gems here, and that with some information that these areas could be improved and restored or remediated and provide needed open space and wild areas in that area, in that region. And so this led to a number of studies in the wetlands around Lake Calumet. So in these areas you can see, and also there's some prairies, Vernon Prairie, which I think is renamed, Headwash Marsh down here, Indian Ridge Marsh, Big Marsh, and so on and so forth. You can probably see that better over here. So a variety of studies aimed at characterizing the biota and the geology, hydrology of those areas. So we had studies of endangered species of birds, studies of again, the geology and hydrology of these areas. We looked at exposure to uptake by tree swallows, which use nest boxes, so they're nice to be able to follow their breeding and how successful they are at nesting, and get materials, find what they're eating, and so on and so forth. A lot of endangered or invasive species in these areas. This purple loosestrife, and they release some beetles there, effectively knocked back that loosestrife quite a bit. And also John Marlin got to use some of his river sediments here on a demonstration project here by the landfill, and grow some nice sunflowers and other things. So again, this resulted in a lot of information after a lot of field study and data analysis. You get to learn things like, you know, where there was a colony of endangered black-crowned night herons in that area that was of great interest in maintaining that population, that breeding colony. You learn things like where they are foraging, what they're eating, and how that's impacting their contaminant exposure. So we learned a lot of the birds were flying up to the lakefront rather than to contaminated areas like the Lake George, Indiana Ship Canal, which was a good thing for the colony because you can see here in this pattern that that resulted in a lower exposure for those chicks. Document the biodiversity of the site. There were numerous studies by entomologists and plant ecologists, and also studies of invasive species, how those endangered species are using invasive species, how they're competing with native species. And again, here I mentioned the tree swallow project and how those are being exposed, how and to what degree they're being exposed as environmental contaminants. And this was some of the work that George Roadcap and others did, looking at the complex geology of this that we've created and how that affects the hydrology and how we might go about remediating this environment. And again, these resulted in a number of reports that you can, ISTC is a clearinghouse for those reports, and also a number of peer-reviewed publications, again, making the results of those studies available to the broader scientific community. And beyond this, the surveys were also involved in a variety of planning issues, so not just applied research on the ground, but also these other groups, and I may have forgotten some things, but the work there continues. These areas are being rehabilitated, which is the term that's preferred over restored, because we're never going to be able to restore the original function, but things could be dramatically improved from what they were. And this resulted in the Calumet Open Space Reserve, which is part of the Millennium Reserve, which is designed to intertwine economy, community, and the environment, and essentially incorporate natural resources into the urban planning of those areas. And I mentioned that these things are ongoing, and our involvement is less than it was at one time, but I think we ought to be proud of anybody that was involved in those early studies, because we really kind of kicked this off and helped to show what could be, what was possible. And I think Nicole summed it up much better than I could. And I'll just let you take a second and read over that. As you may know, Nicole is now the executive director of Save the Dunes in northern Indiana, and also that Suzanne Malik is executive director of Chicago Wilderness. So this is inside there. So where do we go from here? I talked about these studies, these collaborations that happened in the past, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for future collaborations. There are, this was just crying out as an issue for survey collaboration involving the contamination of karst areas, as you know, as groundwater infiltration or surface water infiltration of limestone areas. And so we need geologists and hydrologists and chemists and biologists who work on cave life, right, to see what is going on, what are the impacts to that unique life. And also an emerging issue, contamination issue, if you're not aware of it. There are 91 known coal combustion waste, or ash pits, in Illinois. Only a third of those are mined, and there's some indication that amongst those, some of those miners may be failing. few of them have groundwater monitoring. There's some controversy over the current rule for the long-term storage of those, what needs to be done with those pits when you're closing them up. And some have caused known or suspected groundwater contamination. So with 91 of these out there, there's bound to be some stinkers that are going to need some investigation. And in fact, one is relatively close to home. This is the Dynegy Vermilion Generating Station near Collison, Illinois. And basically checking myself, got a little bit of money from Prairie Rivers Network to look at this, at least look at the concentrations of elements in the water and some of the aquatic biota. So here's the site of Illinois Power site initially. It's like Dynegy is buying up these defunct coal-fired power plants and running them to the end until they're beyond their useful life. And the river comes down here, and this river is, the water is narrow and it's deep, and the water is really forced into this river during high water precipitation events. And there's a huge velocity coming down this river, and it hits this bank right here. And this is what this looks like. These are gabions that were put in some time ago. I don't remember how long they've been there. And they're already been torn down. This is the toe of this ash pit here. Right here. This is right here. A huge velocity of water, and comes down and it hits this, and these are these ash pits. And we did document there is an increased concentration of elements that you would expect to find in fly ash, right, in the water at certain times. In fact, here at a very low level in the river, you see this yellow boy, which is a term that mining people use to denote water that has a very high concentration of iron and some other things in it. But what I'm afraid is going to happen is, I agree with some others that suggested that this river just wants to cut through. That's what it does. It's relentless, right? And when it does, hopefully it won't have a problem like happened with the Dan River and the Duke Energy site. And all this fly ash went into the Dan River, and now it's coating the bottom of that river, and who knows how long this is going to impact that water. So that could happen in 10 years. It could be 100 years. I don't know. Maybe longer, but it is an issue. Also, the US EPA lists 73 Superfund sites in Illinois. Some of these you might recognize. Obviously, it's just a handful of those. Some of them are complex. Some of them are not so complex. A lot of these are NPL listed sites, or National Priorities lists, so they are at levels of concern, contamination concern. Just an example, it was brought up before, is the Sauget area. And I know that ISTC had done some sampling for that. The NRDA is only in midstream. It's being conducted as we speak. There has been some cleanup, but a lot remains. And so this is another one of those complex issues, different parcels, different areas of contamination, a lot of concern about potential human risks, human health risks. The natural resources risks here aren't as apparent as maybe some other sites. There is a Frank Holton State Park is nearby, which is regularly visited by a number of state and federal endangered species. Also, this is this was part of the American Bottoms, which is figures pretty prominently in the history of the United States, right? Because the Spanish and French were on this side and so on and so forth. But also, this overlies that karst area that I talked about earlier. And so, I think we don't know what the potential is for contamination and what has occurred already. So. And also, NRDAs, we have spills, right, accidental releases all the time. and they're going to continue to occur. And so these are just some, I don't know how updated this is. I mean, I just took it off the DNR website. But there's a need for investigations, for studies of the fate of contaminants, exposure of natural resources to those contaminants, and monitoring afterward, after the cleanup and remediation activities. And so I think there's place at these tables for ISTC and the surveys to conduct environmental related work. And again, we hope that we can stop or lessen the waste stream and contamination, but we do have these legacy contaminants remaining, and there may be some that we've yet to discover. Tom Heavysides suggested that that again there really is a place for the surveys in these programs, but of course the big issue is funding, especially with our fiscal climate now. We really need some out-of-the-box thinking for how to fund these things. So with that, I'll sign off. Thank you.